This. Okay, there we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Coding Zeal stream, if I can speak correctly. Glad to have you here. My name is Eric Guzman. Talk to me, Guzman, on Twitch. And I am accompanied with 3 other lovely individuals. Let's see. Let's go from left to right on my screen. So we'll start with Nate. Introduce yourself.
Hello again. I don't know if you know this. I was with Mr. Eric last Friday about some accessibility. I'm just back for more today. Hopefully diving into some sweet JavaScript debugging.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nate. He's a glutton for live streaming now. And next, a new face, Chris White.
Hey everybody, Chris White here. I'm on Team Ruby / Team Pry, so look forward to it.
Nice. And Mati, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back. I had joined you. We talked about mono repos for a while. That was really fun. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about some JavaScript debugging and hopefully learn a few things.
Definitely. Awesome. All right, so let's just get right into it then. So our topic today is JavaScript debugging, Ruby on Rails debugging, strategies, techniques. Definitely want to try to focus on kind of like beginner friendly, focus on simple strategies anyone can use to effectively debug their code and understand what the dang heck's going on and why it's not working. So I just wanted to start off the conversation initially with if anyone had an interesting war story about a tricky bug that they encountered in their past.
Yeah, I can start. In one of my earliest programming gigs, I was kind of just thrown off the deep end and didn't have a lot of programming experience, but was given the chance to do it. And I spent probably over an hour early on in that job, just like hammering, refresh and trying over and over again to get something that I was doing in my code to show up on the screen. And I was hammering refresh on the production site, not on my test instance.
Oh no.
Must feel good.
Classic.
Very classic. So make sure you're looking at the right version of your site.
Yeah.
Debugging 101.
Yeah, well, I've done that as well, so don't feel alone. I think everyone's done it at least once, but
Oh, yeah.
that's great when you do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
What was it? Last week, I was trying to fix a bug or work on some work, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why nothing was updating. I thought my whole system was broken, and then I realized I was looking at everything on staging and not local. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, no matter how many times you change your local, it's not going to update that. I've been in scenarios where I'm working locally, and my my dev server, Webpack dev server, stops refreshing on changes, which is just random. That's pretty frustrating when that happens because you're changing the code, refreshing the page, changing code, refreshing the page, and then it just stops working. So it's a bit painful when that happens, but it does happen.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that outside of Docker, or is that like, have you seen that just with a straight Create React app without Docker?
Not with a out of the box Create React app, but definitely Docker. Like just when you're watching millions of files, you tend to run into those more often.
Yeah.
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 Pretty horrific. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, after you, Mati.
I have a pretty funny war story. If we want to go into that. So I was working with a client helping them build this React app, and I had to figure out how to do server-side rendering in PHP, which, I don't really do PHP. So it was challenging. And I to not go too far down the rabbit hole with this, I got it working. It was cool. It was out in the dev environment. It was working great. And it was the day to go live. And we released it. And I hit the button and I pushed it out. And it was completely broken. And I was so the VP of IT was there, and the dev team. And I was a contractor, so I felt a bit of pressure. And I had the DevOps team on the call trying to what was going on, because it was the same code in dev, same code in production. Like, it doesn't make sense. And it turned out I had the DevOps team run a scan on the packages of the CentOS server in dev and the CentOS server in prod, and there's different versions of the packages installed somehow. And so as soon as they synced up the package versions with dev, for some reason, the dev server was scaffolded out or built out differently than the production server, although they were supposed to be the same. They weren't. As soon as that happened, the app worked like a gem. Like, it was perfect. And it was like one of those experiences where I was just banging my head against a wall. It couldn't have, and I knew it wasn't the code, and it was environmental. And that was like when it actually worked, and they like reinstalled the packages on the production server and then reloaded, and the thing worked. It was like dove flew out of the sky. It was awesome. It was probably like one of the harder things I had to figure out, like, with pressure. It was fun.
That's scary.
Yeah, very.
It makes you. We really take for granted the fact that you can just like swap out Ruby versions or Node versions pretty easily in our environments today. I remember early on, like I was working on a PHP app, and there was like a very small behavior difference between the PHP version that I could install on my Mac and the one in production, and it was a pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Golden days of enterprise releases. Those are great.
Yeah.
Chasing down DLLs, binaries, all that. I'm glad we don't have to deal with that as much anymore with containers and just rolling deploys and things like that.
So I have a similar story to you, Monty. At a previous job, we were doing deployment. Everything was good. Everything worked locally. We deployed out, and for some reason, one of our React UI was just completely on the fritz. It just wasn't working. Locally, it worked fine. Same to code on production, and we couldn't figure out why. And then after spending some time looking at stuff, realized that with all the Dockerization, containerization, and stuff like that, the yarn lock wasn't included. So after I cleared my caches locally, it pulled down an updated version of one of the libraries we were using that introduced a bug, and when it's minor patches. So it still happens very easily if you don't configure your applications correctly.
Yes.
Oh man, that's a tough one. With no lock files, you don't know what you're getting. Yikes.
Yeah.
That would make for like a fun coding exercise. Like, let's play dependency roulette where we get a random version of every library we want to use.
Might be an awesome April Fool's as well, just to remove yarn lock files or manually go edit a couple of lines in there. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun, actually. Let's not do that.
No, that's evil fun.
A slight tangent. Some evil fun I used to have at a previous gig. This is really bad. I would do a find replace in their node modules. And update a bunch of code in their node modules. That's really hard to figure out. But it was a training exercise.
Yeah. That's how you labeled it. Sure.
Give me a second.
Nice.
For some reason, my headphones just decided to switch over. Okay. My Bluetooth headphones are being weird. But, all right. So let's start diving into debugging. So we're going to split this up, and we're going to start with some JavaScript debugging, and then we're going to jump into some Rails debugging. So let me switch my screens over, and we'll get into this screen. Oh, it looks like we lost Mati in the Windows. Oh well. So we're
I'm not dead yet.
He's gone but not forgotten. Let's see. So we're going to be introducing our La Jolla Playhouse application that we introduced the other day, or the last stream. Not the other day. I did the same thing you did, Nate.
Yeah, it's all good. It feels like a day ago, It's how fresh it is.
Yeah, okay. So we have a bug in the La Jolla Playhouse application, and I'll demonstrate what the bug is, and then I'll take it over to Chris and whoever on how you would try to figure out what the issue is, especially since you're not familiar with the code base all that much, which is a very valid situation to be in. So we go to our locations page. We don't have too much going on right now in this application. So we go to locations, and we have 2 bookings. In this bookings, I open this up, and I have one book date in here. But the problem is that this field shouldn't look like this. It shouldn't be a form field yet. To show you what it should look like it should look like a button. There we go. That's it. Let's see. It came back. What's going on? Now it's back. So there's some inconsistencies in the UI with this add workshop date. It's the same component. So this date field and this add workshop date are the exact same component, but for some reason it's not being consistent. So as you see, we came back into the page, has the right state, but if we load it in the first time, it's showing the form field state that should only be present once we click on it. So that's the bug. And I'll take it over to you guys to start talking about how we would go about, trying to figure out what the heck's going on, and more details or anything like that.
So being front end heavy myself, I would dive into what data is being passed to that component.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume this is a React app. So if that's the case, we should probably be using React DevTools.
Yeah.
So we'll open my handy dandy DevTools inside of Chrome.
All right. So, and
Back.
if you can explain, React DevTools is what exactly?
All right. So those of you not familiar with just debugging in general, every browser comes with a inspection / debugging tool set, usually referred to as DevTools, that you pop open. I think most of them are like Command or Control I, Shift I, Command Option I on Mac. But anyway, you can right click on it in just about any browser and say inspect an element. It'll pop them open for you. So that's like your standard table stakes dev tools that are built into each browser. On top of that, if you're a React developer, they have another nice set of tools called React Dev Tools, which is a Chrome extension that you install. So you go out to Chrome, whatever, extensions.com, let's say, and you can find that. It's usually the top choice.
Yeah.
So, yep, there you go.
And what you
and I
happen
believe
to
those are
install.
compatible.
Sorry.
Yeah, so Chrome and Firefox both are natively supported. I'm not sure about the latest version of whatever Edge is, but I know Firefox and Chrome both support React developer tools. What this allows you to do is take a deeper dive into how data is being passed around your virtual DOM that React is in charge of. Basically, it's what it does for diffing and building out your actual DOM. So going back to the Playhouse, let's take a look at the two purple icon things there. Those are the dev tools I had spoken about. So if you click on components, this allows us to dive into that virtual DOM I was talking about for React. And nice little thing that they give you here is on the left-hand side, there is a arrow inside of a box. That's basically like a little pointer tool. So you can click on the visual element in the page that you want to see the virtual DOM of. So in this case, probably, yeah, any one of those guys. This particular component is an input. So generally, like you get a lot of these context.consumers, depending on how you build out your custom components. So rather than trying to hunt down the tree view there on the left where Eric is highlighting now, I would go down to the bottom right. And those items there kind of do a inside out. So the very top one is the leaf. And as you go down, you see the ancestors of each component. So in this case, it's just a data input. But it's coming, so Formic is a form library for React. And then Formic is passing values down to that field and so on. So it's like it trickles down. Somewhere in there, I can imagine, not looking at the actual component in the code itself, there is something that says, hey, if I have a value, show it, or like basically a Boolean flag to hide or show based upon some sort of data somewhere. Mm-hmm. So in this case, Formic has, I think, like a values attribute or prop. I know this because I've used Formic. So if you read the documentation on Formic, it should have some kind of prop collection called values somewhere down in one of its children, I think. And feel free to jump in here because I'm not exactly sure. Okay, so there's value. That's good. And then down at the bottom of that is values.
There you go.
So workshop date is an empty string here. So that tells us that the data coming in at least is an empty string for that particular input. If we go and actually look at the code for date input for that component inside of the VS Code, so now basically what we've done is verify that the data that we're getting into that input is empty string. So now we know the state. So if we go in and look at that date input component, we can determine how that's being passed down from Formic to that particular component, and maybe there's some kind of flag that says hide or show this based upon that workshop date.
So typically, so this application's a Rails application. Are you familiar with the structure of Rails applications and how where they put their components, Nate?
No, but I bet you I could find it.
So that I'm curious about how you would go about your strategies. Hey, I don't fully understand this code base. How would you go about trying to find the component in question you're looking for?
So there's some visual hints that I'd probably be poking around, but I'm really lazy. So I know the component's name is date input. So I would do in VS Code, because all the files are indexed, I would do Command P, which will bring up a indexed file browser, and type date input exactly how it was spelled in the component tree. So capital D, capital I, but it's not really case sensitive in here anyway. So that would give me a hint of where to find it. Looks like there might be a component called date input. So I would just hit enter and go directly to that.
Cool.
So this shows me the shared component, because data input, I imagine, is used in several places. But it doesn't necessarily give me an idea of how it's integrated into that particular page. So I need to find out where it's being used.
Mm-hmm.
So typically I'll find the export of that component in that file and right click on it and say find all references.
So go find all references. Okay.
Yep. And in here, this will give you a list of places that it's being consumed. And we've only got 2 for some reason. Interesting. Maybe
I can tell you how to find it.
Used.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Do a global search. A global search for date input.
Okay.
This is how I find stuff.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, you can do that too. Let's do it. Because this finding all references is not being fruitful.
Yeah. So
I'll open the magnifying glass guy on the right.
Command Shift F or something like that.
Either one.
All right. Let's see. So date input. Okay. Let's see.
Oh.
There we go.
That looks familiar. Yeah, look at that. All right.
So I wonder, Nate, why VS Code wouldn't have been able to make that inference? Is it probably because of like how Webpack is set up and able to like track references?
I haven't the slightest. It seems like it's relatively pathed here, so it should find that. I can't tell you why it didn't do that.
But it seems to be used as a prop, and I wonder if references.
Well, this reference here on line 10 is the relative reference to where it's coming from.
Oh, I see where you're looking
So
at.
I would expect it to find that.
Yeah. Let's take a look real quick. Just out of curiosity.
Oh, Lord. Okay. So there's a little bit of nesting going on there. So all right, let's go back to the, on the right, the find reference tag tab on the right. It's like the 4th from the bottom. It's like 2 files copied.
It's from the bottom. Above the Docker whale?
Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry. So I thought it would be, no, maybe. I was expecting to see in this list that index file that we just looked at. Don't know why it's not there. I haven't the slightest. But typically you would expect to see it there. That's okay. We got to where we needed to go with Mati's global search of the world. Found it. Good job.
Shotgun approach.
There you go.
Yes.
Instead of going fancy,
I do what you did first, though. I always do F12 find all references. If it doesn't show up, then I do a global find because it's a mess usually. I mean, it's not the best way to go about doing that.
Sure.
Yeah.
One is certainly more focused. So in my case, it's focused in theory on only the places that are affected by if you were to change it. Monty's is just full text searching.
all else fails, full text search. There you go. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Nope.
All right. Now that we have the file, how would we diagnose our little issue?
I would find the reference to date input in the rendered output of the component.
All right. Well, let's see. Actually, if we can double click on this element to highlight it, and then it should highlight wherever else that element is at. So right there.
Yes.
So just from my observation looking at this component, it looks like this component has this button divider. So this is what the one we want to show up, but doesn't when it's first rendered in. So if there are locations, we want this button to show up. If there are no locations on the page, we want this to show up.
Got it. Okay, so yeah, you've got some shortcut rendering code in there to say if status equals button. Right. Okay. So how are we getting our status set here?
Let's see. So right now, we're getting our status. We're using React hooks to set the status of the form. So we default to form when we initially render. And we try, and then we query, and then the way the logic's flowing is we fetch workshop dates, and it should go into here, and if we have workshop dates, we set the status to button. So it always shows the button if there's workshop dates. But for some reason, that's not working.
Okay. I can keep going.
Yeah, go for it.
Unless someone wants to take the baton. Okay. All right. So apparently our data is coming back with some sort of workshop date to set that. So we need to then debug what our service is returning to us. So not being a Rails guy, this is kind of the place where I would do a console log in my React component. So where you have the set status of button, I would just be outputting, let's say, data to determine what that shape is, or even more specifically, data.workshop dates.
As an actual Rails guy, I endorse this behavior.
All right. We don't have
And since
hot
this
module
is-
reloading.
Yeah,
so we'll
since
have
this
to
is a React component, it's going to render in the console of your dev tools. Theory.
Okay. Interesting. We didn't hit that console log. If I go back into it, we do hit that console log now.
Okay.
So it seems like on the first load of the page, it's not hitting this console log, but if we get back to it, it's perfectly fine.
I wonder if there's any new behavior on like navigation. How does navigation work between those two views?
That is a good question. I believe we are just using the navigation library. Let's find out. Nope, that is not it. I am not looking in the wrong spot. Where is our root element? Pages. Home. Yeah, we're using a React router do navigation apparently. And then if anyone else wants to chime in with taking a look, you're more than welcome. So here's rendering the locations for the page. What other ways would you guys take a look? Here's the nav bar too.
All right, so I'm having a hard time understanding completely the issue. Like it's rendering an input when it's not supposed to be. So you had pointed out the button divider, right? That is jumping in at random times. It seems like, is it reproducible? Can you guarantee when it shows up?
It seems the only way to guarantee when it shows up is when the data has already been loaded on the page. So if I were to, so if I go back to this workshop, or I guess this workshop or this booking, it always shows up. But if we do a first load, the first time we load this data, it seems to not hit that console log and always show this.
I think one thing you want to take a look at is how when you're calling that, and it looks like there's some sort of timing issue. And if you look at your use effect, the second argument you're passing is an empty array, and so that's your dependencies, and those are triggers to run this code again. So what it may be is that it's running this the first time through, kind of like on component did mount, and that use query that gets the dates, that's an asynchronous thing. So it's getting the data, and then once it has that data, it doesn't actually call that code again. So that if you added data as a dependency, that might trigger the refresh.
Good call.
Good call. Let's see if that's going to do the thing, the code. Let's wait for it to load. Oh, hey. It's working.
Sweet.
So if useEffect has no dependencies, does that mean that our I guess our console.log was nested inside that if, right?
Right.
So what if we bumped that console log like outside of the if? Would we have seen a more useful message?
We would have seen data with null.
Or I guess
it would float
inside of our useEffect block, but before the if. Perhaps then we would have seen that there was no data initially.
Yeah. So if you have your linter set up, one awesome thing about it is there is a React hooks lint like plugin that would yell at you because you're not adding the right dependencies to your use effect. It would say that any variables that you're referencing inside of your use effect need to be added to your dependency list at the end of use effect there, your array. So because we weren't doing that, use effect, if you remember, like classic class style React components had a component did mount. It's equivalent to that. So once it's mounted, run this code one time. But once you start adding those dependencies, it's no longer component did mount. It's actually component did update based upon only the dependencies that you've provided in that array. So that's probably what most people care about, but that's some of the background on it.
And that's something really interesting because stereotypically, people complain about linters because they say linters just impose style roles. You know, it's like, oh, I don't like a linters because it's telling me I have to use 4 spaces instead of 2 and tabs versus spaces. But linters could also be a valuable tool for helping you debug or preemptively catch issues in your code.
Yeah.
And sounds like it.
Yeah, and it's probably a classic debate of what a linter is supposed to do. So with the recent, not so recent anymore, but Prettier's goal is to make your style the same, whatever your style chooses to be. And linter's job are to prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot. So some of the rules in there are well, most of the rules that you implement through your linter is to prevent you from doing things that may cause side effects.
Mhm.
And then, of course, you can always override whatever your linter is yelling at you about, but it's pretty much saying, I acknowledge that, but you're wrong. But that's my opinion on linters. For the most part, is they're great. They prevent you from hurting yourself.
Yeah. And just a little.
Yeah, I think that's the
Go ahead.
Sure. I would say that what Eric was saying is kind of the initial experience that people have with linters is that I have to make sure that everything's formatted right before I can move on. But as you get more familiar with them and start to incorporate things like Prettier, where you're not even paying attention to your formatting. I write like big nasty hash blocks or object blocks with no indentation, and then I run my auto formatter and it does that work for me, and I don't even really consider how I format those blocks anymore. But whenever I have a syntax error, it's gonna make my entire screen red, and I'll find it before. I won't have to spend a lot of time debugging to find where that syntax error is.
Yeah. And just to point out, I purposely commented out that exhausted dependency linter issue.
Sneaky, you sneaky dog, you.
So it's true that it would have caught it because it would have said it right here and fixed it for us.
There you go.
Nice.
So
something real quick that actually I took this. This is just a small little thing that I stole from Nate. I saw him doing this, and if you throw that console log with data back in, if you were to wrap that just with curly braces and so put curly braces around data, like make it an object, so data is an object. Yeah, so I never used to do this until I started pairing a lot with Nate, and I saw him doing this, and I was like, why are you doing that? And then it dawned on me that like if you just start throwing stuff in your console logs, you're just getting values in your console, and you don't know what they are. When you wrap them with those curly braces, it actually gives you a key, and you actually know what you're logging. It's a little bit quicker, so you can actually see. I guess it does say data in there, but yeah.
there you go. That's actually
and before it was just giving you undefined instead of the word data.
Right.
I've seen them where you pass you can pass multiple parameters to console.log. I forget if it's, I think the first parameter canning, where you would pass the string data, and then the second parameter would be just the variable, and that would prefix it in your console as well.
Yeah, if I'm getting serious about logging, I'll do like a key with a colon and like create steps through my console logs, and then console log all my objects out of there.
The trusty console log. But I love that tip.
Yep.
I'm going to use that for now on too.
Yeah, because I'm really lazy. I don't like typing labels or typing things twice. So just wrapping them gives me an explicit label, because it's then an object that you're debugging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to start using that now. That's awesome.
There you go. Pro tip.
So if we want to, we can talk about console.table. It's a helpful little nugget. I've used it today, actually. So console.table is great for when you want to log out an array, essentially. You can also do it for an object, but it doesn't look as pretty. So if you did console.table of data.workshop dates, I think.
Console.table data workshop dates. Okay.
Move that inside of that if statement, because it'll probably explode.
True. All right, now we just wait for it to transpile.
What about the safe navigation operator? Could we have used that to prevent data.workshop dates from blowing up outside of that if statement?
Yes, if your code base is supporting it. Yes,
that's true. I'm just used to this cool language called Ruby that has that built in. Got him.
I'll put a question mark there. Do it. I bet it would transpile it. But yeah, so In this case, there's only one element in the array, but it gives you column headers to match the first prop, or the root props for each element. So it gives you this nice little table of your data.
That's really cool.
And then if you wanted to actually dive into the object, you could expand out the array at the bottom of that table.
Yeah, right there.
I've never seen that before.
First time I'm seeing it too.
There you go. Fun stuff.
Console.table. Yeah, I'm using that from now on too.
Go for it.
All right. So we fixed one bug. Now on to the next one. So our next bug has to do with creating a workshop date. So I go in here, I select a date, I click the button to save, and I get a sad face. Error. Now,
Is the world's smallest sad face playing the world's smallest violin?
tiny violin-ish type errors. So, with just this amount of context that something happened and it wasn't good, who wants to chime in about how we're going to try to debug this issue?
I want to see Chris go at this one.
All right. I guess question one is it the JavaScript or the Ruby developer's fault? I would probably start looking at my Chrome inspector to see if I'm seeing console errors in Chrome, or if I'm getting, maybe there's a network response that could tell me what happened when we tried to submit that.
All right. So we got one console error.
Very cool. Very cool. So it seems like when I see an error like that, I assume that GraphQL has returned a response, that like GraphQL on the backend side is returning an error, and then the error is being presented by our front-end library, which is Apollo in this case. And so I guess the next place I would probably look is the network tab to see what the backend sent back when we tried to submit that form.
Sure.
The network tab only records live, so we might have to repeat that process to see that response.
Okay.
I like to do the XHR filter in the network tab, so that I only see my cool develop.
So the XHR filter only filters out requests to the server? Is that how that works?
That's right. It will eliminate everything that's not an Ajax style request.
Okay.
So you're only seeing like any of your GraphQL communication. There we go. So we've got a GraphQL response. It's code 200, which doesn't mean much in GraphQL land, since GraphQL errors are, I think they're frequently returned with a 200 code. Let's see what's inside of there.
All right.
Awesome. So yeah, we're receiving data from the back end, and it has an errors key, which tells me that it's the Ruby developer's fault. Or perhaps either we're sending data to the back end that is incorrect, from like the front end is sending the wrong kind of data to the back end, or the back end is running into an error during processing that data.
Okay. All right. So we figured out it's the Ruby developer's fault. And
Well, did we figure that out? How did we get to this error? We just went to the form and hit submit. Is that right? So don't quote me on it, but I'm not willing to blame the Ruby developer yet.
All
the
right.
Rails guy is off the hook here, I think, because the UI is passing some invalid data, maybe?
So
Yeah, I guess what.
Oh, go ahead.
How would we dig into that question? Would we maybe compare our GraphQL spec to what the front end is sending to the back end?
So I can tell you right now that I'm taking a look at the header to look at the request, and the request looks like it's to spec. It has a date that we're sending and the location ID that it's associated with. So on the front end side, this was working, but then something broke. Before this was working, yesterday it was working, all of a sudden it just started breaking. No code was changed on the front end.
Okay.
Yep. Blame the Rails guy.
Okay.
Sorry, I tried.
Cool. Can we look at the error message again?
Sure.
If I remember right, it was something about returning a null for a non-nullable field. So in GraphQL mutations, we send a bunch of input and we ask for we ask for response fields. Like if we're creating something, we probably want the ID of that something after it got created, or even like details from that object that we're creating. This error makes me think that maybe the API is getting the request and processing it, and then in the response it's not returning the data that our front end is asking for, or the data that it's supposed to be returning. So let's look at our API and see if we can figure that out. I don't know a lot about this app, but I do know that it's a Rails app using the GraphQL gem. So I would be looking at my app/GraphQL folder.
Okay. And I guess that's an important note to make. It's like when you're trying to debug an application, you should try to figure out, at least get the lay of the land of where the code is. And if you don't know, maybe ask somebody if you're not sure, so that at least you can get your orientation.
I would also be, when I first open a Rails app, the first file I look at is the gem file, because that tells me, what tools they've assembled to get this job done. Hopefully people aren't implementing their own GraphQL libraries and Ruby using open source that we've all, that's been contributed to and validated. So we have, in GraphQL Ruby, you define types and mutations like you would in most libraries. We're looking at the schema file, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So we know that the schema file has a mutation type and a query type. If we look at the mutation type definition, we could probably see where the mutation that we're working with is defined. So probably GraphQL/mutations folder.
No, quick question on a Rails app in VS Code. Can you command click on mutation type?
Most of the time, no. Since Ruby's so dynamic, you probably need a full Ruby IDE to be able to command click through to class definitions. That's a good question, though. I know that I use the Ruby plugin for VS Code, and I don't get that functionality, but I think I've seen it work that way with the Solar Graph extension in VS Code. I think it actually does figure out where all of your classes are defined and kind of create that linking for you.
True, yeah.
So
in order to get that functionality, you have to add in the interpreter into VS Code, which is not a first-class citizen like it is with JavaScript. So you have to add in the plugin and then have the interpreter running on your, which is sometimes not that easy.
For sure. So let's look at that create workshop date mutation. That sounds like where this work should be occurring. I see a lot of what I'm expecting to see already. I see the two arguments that we saw earlier in our front end request. Both of those arguments are required, and then I also see some fields where we have a field called workshop date and a field called errors. Both of them are null false, which is interesting. So we've defined fields in GraphQL are going to be the data that is returned to you after the mutation is complete. And so because they're both set as null false, both of those fields should have values when they get returned to the front end. So I wonder what's going on there. So we see that workshop date. If we look at the resolver, that's where the meat of this is occurring. I see it doing some really basic Railsy stuff like doing workshop date.new and passing some details. One thing I see that I'm not expecting to see is us not using the location ID parameter anywhere. So that's be interesting. I also see in the else block that we're returning nil for workshop date. So yeah, I think that those could be problems. I wonder how we could integrate some debugging steps here to kind of figure things out.
I guess one thing we can try to do is see how, if the workshop date, like what's going on with the workshop date, right?
That's right. I like that.
So in Rails/Ruby, what tools do we use to try to get into the code?
Yeah. There's the puts command, which is pretty similar to console.log. I have a vast preference for immediately jumping to the debugger tool, which would be binding.irb in like default applications, but I would recommend installing the pry gem, which just is kind of like binding IRB, where it will give you your in terminal prompt, but it has a few nicer features, like it has a history and it has all the nice colors that you're used to seeing in a Rails console. So in our create workshop date mutation, let's throw some binding.pry invocations in. I like when I'm not sure where the error is at all, I just throw them everywhere, because we can it will interrupt the execution, but if you exit from pry, it will move on to the next pry. So I want binding pries everywhere. I want it inside the if block. I want it inside the else block. I want to see what is going on at each step here.
So these are equivalent to breakpoints, and let's say the dev tool.
That's right. Breakpoints are the debugger macro in JavaScript. Yeah.
Got it.
All right, we got all the binding pries.
So now that we've set the minefield, let's hit that mutation again.
All right.
Cool. So the browser didn't do anything because we've paused the execution on the Ruby side. Yeah. So we're at our first binding.pry, which is before we initialize that workshop date variable. At this point, we could actually see what our parameters are coming through as. So I'm expecting that the parameters the front end is passing would be available and correct inside this function, but that might not be a good assumption. There could be some error in how I've set up my mutation. So I would just type date and see if what I expect to see is there. That looks good. And I would type location ID and hope to see an integer there. Great. So now I would type exit and get to the next binding.pry.
Okay.
Cool.
And now we're just below.
So we have a workshop date object now, which I'm assuming is a Rails active record model. So if we just type workshop date, we should see something that looks like an active record model. That's good. It has the date as that we passed, but it doesn't have location ID. My guess is that will make it an invalid. There will be a validation that will fail when we attempt to save this. We could probably preview that by doing workshop date.valid ? There we go. So we know that when it goes to the next line and attempts to save, it's going to fail to save it. So if we exit from this pry, we will probably move into the else block.
Yep.
There we go. The little arrow is pointing inside the else block there. And so let's look at workshop date.errors. Cool. So this is active records representation of the errors that occurred when we tried to save it. Location must exist. So we know that on line 11, when we were initializing our workshop date, we should have passed the location ID. in that initialization. And we also, I believe that the reason that we got the error that we did is because it's returning nil for workshop date inside of that else block, and nil is not allowed according to our definition here. So I would actually probably, I think that there are a few different ways you could set this up, but if we have a mutation that may or may not create a workshop date, then I would probably change our fields to allow workshop date to be nil.
Okay. So we would do that by just saying nil, true.
That's right.
And then should we try testing this, making sure that this little thing works first?
Yeah, I like it.
All right. Yeah, I have this philosophy of like small chunks. Fix one bug, test. Next bug, test. I'm not sure if anyone's
like
that way.
I'm exactly that way.
No, it's good practice.
Okay.
So now we're stuck in our pry minefield again, so you'll have to type exit a few times to continue through them.
Okay.
I think that there are other commands in pry that work differently, like step and continue would allow you to like move between lines during your debugging session, but most of the time I'm just typing exit. Exit bang will quit the whole process, so your Rails server at that point would shut down.
Yeah, let's not do that.
If you put a pry in a loop, if I'm like iterating through 100 things and I have a pry in that loop, then I don't want to type exit 100 times. So I'll usually just do exit bang and get out of it. Cool. That's what I want to see. So we're now receiving a GraphQL response that includes an error that it has that errors list that we've defined in our GraphQL API. And it has a helpful error that we could be displaying. It looks like our front end doesn't currently display that to the user. That's probably a future story on this project. But the front end, the lazy front end guys now actually have the stuff that they need to actually do their jobs.
Fantastic.
All right.
But we do actually we have another bug in our Ruby, right?
Okay, I'll let you finish that. But I do a general Rails question.
Sure.
Good. Go ahead.
So on line 11, we know that we're passing a location ID from the front end to the back end. We're just not putting it where it belongs, right? So when we're initializing workshop date, we could pass location ID : location ID to give it that data.
All right. The moment of truth. Do you still keep the binding pries in here, or should we take them out?
Depends on my confidence level. If I'm troubleshooting and going back and forth, I'll leave them in. But I'm willing to stake my reputation on taking them out at this point.
Okay. Betting the farm. All right, let's see. Created.
All right. No demerits today.
There we go. Bug solved.
Fantastic.
Well done. Well done.
So you're going to ask a question, Nate.
Yeah. What's the deal with nil and null?
Nil takes less typing.
Are they the same? Are they just aliases?
Yeah, that's how we talk about null. You'll notice that's funny that in our fields we're doing null true and null false. Those are configuration keys that we're passing to GraphQL Ruby, and the author of GraphQL Ruby has chosen to use null, probably because it's more in line with how the GraphQL spec considers whether things can be null or not.
Yeah. But if you're going to say nil in Ruby, you have to, or null, you have to say nil, not null.
That's right.
Got it. Okay.
It's the creator of Ruby.
I do have another question. So, pry bar, putting those pries in there, will those explode or block for production?
I believe that pry rails by default will not interrupt during production, but Rubocop is our linter in Ruby, and one of the cop rules that I always make sure is on is to do a lint error when you have a binding in there. You definitely don't want your debug code in your production environment if you can avoid it.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. So that kind of, I don't know how we're doing on time. Should we be closing down, or can we continue?
We can continue if you guys want to.